Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Drug Cultures. I'm Sky Hawthorne. This is my show. All opinions expressed here are my own, so is all of the music. And as always, nothing I say on this podcast should be taken as medical advice, especially considering the subject matter in today's episode. I'm not a physician. I cannot and will not recommend that anybody take any drug for any reason. Everything I say on this podcast is intended for entertainment, education, and occasionally, to the best of my ability, harm reduction. Now, joining us on today's episode of Drug Cultures is friend of the pod, Soren Shade. You may remember him from episode 20 when we discussed the article I put out for High Times about Kratom and 7-OH, and particularly the story of why Big Kratom is attempting to have 7-OH criminalized. And there's a whole bunch of perspectives on this. We got into it with Soren last time he was here. There's the good faith interpretation, which is that they're trying to protect kratom consumers from a more dangerous product. And then there's also the more cynical interpretation that has some evidence to it, which basically says, 7-OH was hurting the bottom line of kratom companies, and they wanted to intervene using their connections to the federal government to get it banned, as opposed to competing legitimately, as businesses under capitalism are supposed to do. So that was a great episode. That was actually my most listened to episode of Drug Cultures to date. I always get people reaching out to me, I loved your episode with Soren. When is Soren coming back? Well, the answer is Soren is coming back today for episode 24. And this is actually an episode I'm trying to get out as quickly as possible. Normally I write a script for these little intro monologues, and I didn't write a script today because I think it's a really important thing that he came here to talk about, which is the emergency scheduling of a number of mostly opioid substances. Now, emergency scheduling basically means the government says, hey, this is a clear and present danger to society, but we don't want to go through the long and laborious legal process of presenting evidence. I know I'm editorializing there, but that's really what they're saying. They're like, this is an emergency. We are going to use our emergency powers to criminalize these substances. Now, some of the substances that are on the chopping block are becoming a little bit more well-known. We've already talked about 7-OH, which when I first started talking about it was not a particularly well-known substance. I would be like, hey, I'm doing this article about 7-OH. It's a kratom-derived alkaloid. And the most common answer or response I would get is, what is 7-OH? What is kratom? What is an alkaloid? And that's starting to change. That is starting to change. John Oliver did a segment about, he called the segment gas station drugs. I didn't think it was a very good segment, but he introduced a lot of people to this subject. The New York Times has run a big piece about kratom and 7-OH. Wired ran a big piece about it, both of these after I did the High Times piece. But there's all these other substances that the federal government is attempting to slip into this broad brush attempt to criminalize, to place into Schedule 1. And Soren wanted to come by to talk about, well, I'll be honest, knowing Soren, he wanted to talk about it all. But as he explained to me, he literally doesn't have time to fight for the legality of all of these substances. So in particular, what we talked about are two substances that are at risk of becoming federally illegal. One of which is tianeptine. Tianeptine was actually the original drug that got the moniker gas station heroin. And it's a really fascinating story. I won't step on Soren's toes because he explains it really well. But this was something that for decades, mostly in Europe and outside the United States, was prescribed as an antidepressant. And it worked, about as well as any antidepressant works, which is well for some people and not well for the majority of people. But it was an effective medication, and it was not a medication that people were abusing, really. And then just as recently as 2014, some scientists figured out that the whole proposed mechanism of action for this substance, that it was a selective serotonin reuptake enhancer, like it somehow worked the opposite of SSRIs, that whole mechanism is flawed and not actually how it works. And how it works actually is that it's a mu opioid agonist, which basically means it works the same way as traditional opioids. And some users of tianeptine were already starting to realize, hey, if I use a lot of this stuff, it kind of feels like heroin. And so then it sort of escaped to the gray market, and people were selling it on like nootropics shops online. And then people who were into nootropics started using it in high quantities. And then companies started selling concentrated high-dose versions in gas stations. And that's how it sort of became flagged by the government as a potential drug of abuse in recent years. So we talk about that. But then the most interesting substance, to me at least, is this novel, technically it's a designer opioid. It only hit the markets in 2023. It's called SR17018. And basically it is a very effective opioid for what you want to use an opioid for medically, which for the most part is pain. But not only does it not, have a well-known risk of dependence, and it doesn't have any overdose potential, but it also seems to reduce people's tolerance and cravings and withdrawal symptoms for other opioids. And that's pretty unheard of in an opioid, to reduce your tolerance to other opioids. That's the exact opposite of what you normally expect most opioids to do. So of course I want to step back here and remind you what I reminded you at the start of this episode, which is that I am not a doctor. I'm not telling you to go on the internet and order SR17018 right now. Far be it from me to make that recommendation. I am just a podcast host. And the reason I am advocating for SR17018 to remain legal is so that people who actually know what they're doing can research it, so that doctors can study its effect on patients, so that scientists can better study its effect on lab animals and in a general population. Epidemiologists can study the way it is being used. Sociologists can study the communities in which it is currently being used and the way it's being incorporated into other opioid treatments like ibogaine or methadone, Suboxone, the sort of traditional opioid maintenance therapy drugs. But none of this is going to be possible, or it's going to be much, much, much harder to do if this thing, for really no good reason, gets put into Schedule 1. And the last point I want to emphasize before we get to the interview, and this is the point that's going to maybe raise some hackles on some people, but we are in this overdose epidemic right now, right? We are still in the crisis of people overdosing from fentanyl and other fentanyl analogs. And yet we are also in a time that is comparatively much, much safer supply of opioids that you can order on the internet than there was even half a decade ago. There are all sorts of opiate drugs that are relatively safe compared to street drugs like fentanyl that are very easy to come by. And I'm not saying that that is inherently a good thing, but I am saying that for a lot of people, this is a very important harm reduction tool for a lot of active drug users to keep them alive and to keep them able to live their lives. And all of this has the very real risk of having the rug pulled out from under these people, if the government doesn't adopt a dramatically different course. So I'm sure I have more to say about this topic. I'm sure I could ramble about how much I respect Soren's work, how much I respect his work on Hamilton's Pharmacopoeia and the Hamilton Morris podcast. He was involved in producing, I should say, both of those projects. But really, I want to let this conversation speak for itself. So we will be back with more Soren Shade for you, as requested, after this break. I am so happy to have returning to Drug Cultures friend of the pod, Soren Shade. You might know Soren Shade from his work producing the Hamilton Morris podcast or season 3 of Hamilton's Pharmacopoeia, or if you have ever consumed any of his kratom products, he runs the company Top Tree Herbs. Um, and Soren, last time you were on the podcast, we talked a little bit about my High Times article about the prohibition of 7-OH and sort of the shady forces behind it. And just last week, you produced an incredible video that feels very thematically related to it that I just watched actually. So I'm wondering if you want to talk a little bit about that video that Hamilton Morris just put out that you had a real hand in creating.
Yeah, sure. So, what is on YouTube right now that is titled The Chemistry of 7OH is just a chunk of what is going to be probably close to a 90-minute documentary that is that looks at the what is going on in the kratom space in the United States right now, but more broadly is the telling of the global history of opioid prohibition. And this is sort of where I am split in two directions, where there's the part of me that is just hurts for all of the people who are about to be thrown into withdrawal and are going to have their rights taken away from them and are going to be moved to a more dangerous market for their opioids than what exists right now, which is a remarkably safe opioid market. Not discussing addiction liability of these things, but with regard to like the therapeutic window and the likelihood of respiratory depression or contraindications causing fatal outcomes in people, we are in a remarkably safe period with available gray market opioids. And so part of me really aches that this is right around the corner, and I foresee thousands of people suffering, if not dying, as a result of as a direct result of the actions of this administration and the DEA and the scheduling of 7-hydroxymetragine, MGM-15, MGM-16, metragenine pseudoindoxil, SR17018, tianeptine, odesmethyltramadol, and then 3 other orphines that are listed: SR14968, chlororphine, and spirochlororphin. All of these compounds are relatively safe, and the government has moved to ban them right now, and that sucks. But then there's the part of me, the producer part of me, who's making this documentary about the global history of opioid prohibition, and we've been working on it for like 4 months now, is like, wow, what a time to be making a documentary about opioid prohibition and why it doesn't work and why it causes way more harms and does not benefit public health in any way, shape, or form. So it is a great time to be documenting what's going on with an interest in telling this story, but it is a tragedy for everyone else that cares about rights and cares about the drug war. But this specifically, this little chapter that we released it within 10 days of being on set and shooting. So land on set, film for 4 days of 20 hours of shooting, fly home, bring on an editor, and in 6 days release what we released, with the intention of trying to spur some comments to hhs.gov so people could oppose the prohibition or leave a recommendation as what the dosing cap might be. And so this piece that we released was very bent in towards a specific advocacy purpose. And it lacks a lot of nuance, and it lacks a lot of the complexities that I would like to bring into a story about kratom in the United States and a story about opioid prohibition. But our arm was twisted by the deadline that the DEA gave, which was less than a 30-day comment period, which I think is illegal and should be challenged. But they gave us less than what was required to be a 30-day comment period. And then this the notice window officially expires on the 5th, and so we'll find out what the DEA does. So we were hopeful that the documentary was able to spur some people and advocates and moving forward. But the broader documentary is going to be a lot more nuanced. It's not going to be vehemently pro 7-hydroxymetragine. That's not our intentions here. Our intentions here are really to sort of shine a light on what actually happens when a drug is prohibited, and does it accomplish the things that we present as the reasons why we have a war on drugs, or does it do something more sinister? Is it the root of a lot of unnecessary suffering? These are questions that we're tackling in this broader piece, and really excited to continue working on it and get it out hopefully before 2027 rolls around.
So talk a little bit more about this emergency prohibition that's going on with all of these opioid and opioid related substances. Like what is happening? When do we find out? I heard some people saying that we might hear a decision about all this as soon as August 6th. I don't know how long it's going to take me to get this episode out. I'm hoping to expedite it, but you might be listening to this after August 6th and the news is already broke. So Soren, just tell us a little bit about why all these substances are on the chopping block and what the timeline is looking like.
Yeah, I mean, the why is the big question. For 7-hydroxy, we were able to, figure out who was putting pressure where to try to move this along. Sky, you're very aware of that. You covered a lot of it first in that High Times piece before eventually the New York Times and Wired ended up with the exact same story. So you heard it from Sky first. So with
brag.
not to brag, yeah, not to brag. I might have been background for quite a few of those stories that are out there. Just trying to make people aware of the insanity that's going on. So the why for the 7-OH is a lot more transparent. The why for the MGM15, MGM16, metragine, pseudo, and doxil, it seems to fit very squarely within the why for why 7-hydroxy is being scheduled, which I guess I should state it is because legacy kratom businesses are threatened by the emergence of 7-hydroxymetragine as a business, and the sympathetic read on it is they feel threatened because they think that it's creating bad optics for them and will ultimately shut down the whole kratom space, period. All of it will go because of 7-hydroxy. And then the more cynical read is it's just taking a lot of money from them, and they're using any tool in their toolkit to remove it from the market so that they can continue to expand their market. The truth is, depending on who you ask, somewhere in the middle between those things likely. But the why for the other drugs is really, really confusing, and that is what I lie in bed at night trying to reconcile with. So I guess going back further to try to understand why this is a hard thing to understand is knowing how drugs are made illegal. And the DEA essentially has two main methods in which they criminalize substances. The first one is their standard rulemaking procedure, where they reach out to the HHS, they get some information from, and they also say, hey, can you check and see if there's any analogs of this, or if this drug itself has specifically been listed as an investigational new drug, or there's a new drug application out for it somewhere, or if there's clinical trials going on for it. If HHS says no, none of this is going on, nor any of its analogs, salts, esters, isomers, etc., are being scheduled, then they'll move forward and say, can you write an 8-factor analysis of this substance and how it harms public health, has a high potential for abuse, is potentially a precursor for controlled substance, etc. There are a lot of things that they have to consider. And then the HHS goes through that. They take some time and they write out their 8-factor analysis, then give it to the DEA and say, hey, rubber stamp, go ahead and make this drug a Schedule 1 drug. Because it's almost always Schedule 1 that they're putting things in. The other schedules don't really matter to them. And they don't really exist in the legal world either. It's really just the DEA cares about Schedule 1 substances because that gives them the most authority. And then there's a secondary route in which the DEA can criminalize substances, which is emergency scheduling, which is a temporary scheduling that the DEA does that lasts 2 hours with the two 2 years, that it's in Schedule 1, with the option to temporarily extend it to another year to make it 3 years that it's in Schedule 1. And for that, they only have to prove that it meets 3 factors to place it in Schedule 1, which is imminent public health, liability for abuse, and toxicity potential. And for all of these compounds in the 5 different listings, so I believe it's 9 compounds, 5 listings, 4 of the listings were temporary scheduling emergency actions. 7-hydroxy is temporary emergency scheduling action. MGM 15, 16, pseudoindoxil, that's 1 notice, those are temporary. O-desmethyl tramadol, temporary. And then the 4 orphines, including SR17018, temporary. Whereas tianeptine, which was listed 2 days after, I guess it would have been pseudoindoxil MGM 15, it was the last in their onslaught of scheduling synthetic opioids, and they're using formal rulemaking for that. For the HHS actually has prepared an 8-factor analysis, which is really weird. It almost feels like the HHS has probably been working on this for several years and then just decided that, hey, this is the week that we're scheduling everything. Let's just throw this one out there as well. So there's a lot of people in the space saying that Jerry Cash, the owner of Botanic Tonics, is behind all of these things being scheduled.
Who you might know as J.W. Ross, if you don't know as Jerry Cash. He's the Feel Free guy. Just giving some context here.
Yeah, absolutely. No, Jerry Dale Cash is the name he was born with before he seems like he snitched on an Oklahoma politician for taking bribes and was able to get out of jail early. And so he changed his name to J.W. Ross to avoid some of the repercussions that came from that. He tells the story as he snitched on white supremacists in prison who were planning on killing someone. But if you Google his name, you see he got out because he snitched on a politician for taking bribes.
Hey, maybe the politician was also a white supremacist. I mean, this is...
America?
In America?
No! Honestly, actually, maybe he was just telling the truth the whole time. That's really progressive of Jerry to refer to politicians as white supremacists. That's super woke of him.
And gang members? I mean...
Yes, so I don't think that you can, as much as I would like to blame Jerry for this, I don't think that he's behind anything other than the lobbying to move the kratom alkaloid and alkaloid analogs into Schedule 1. I mean, if anything, if he was being smart, he would want the proliferation of SR17018 because most people on Reddit are reportedly using it to stop using 7-OH and MGM15. So it gets a little complicated, although that's maybe too much logical thinking to be ascribed to a very illogical process, which is the law generally. So the background is that there are 2 scheduling options for the DEA, and for all of these, they have to first put a notice in the Federal Register giving 30 days for parties and shareholders and people with vested interest, the public, to comment, which they have subsequently decided to actually not let the public do for the emergency scheduling. So we're challenging all of that, but I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. So that's the background for what the DEA is doing and all the compounds that they've listed to be scheduled right now.
Yeah, and that's a very comprehensive background. I'm obviously cognizant of the fact that, that XKCD comic where it's the 2 geologists talking about how it's easy to forget that most lay people probably only know the formula for feldspar and olivine. And I'm cognizant of us as drug geeks talking about all these opioid agonists that probably a lot of people don't know a lot of detail about, but I do want to narrow down in a couple of these substances in particular. Because when it comes to 7-OH, when it comes to MGM-15, say what you will, and I'm a committed anti-prohibitionist, but these do seem to be substances that, if abused, cause dependence and withdrawal and sort of the classic portfolio of addiction symptoms. But SR17018, to the best of what I can tell, and I hadn't heard of this substance until maybe a few months ago, but it seems to be an opioid agonist, so structurally kind of similar to these other things, but it has the pain relieving properties without any of the associated euphoria and recruitment of beta arrestin, which is what causes respiratory depression. And it also seems to have this really weird effect where it reduces tolerance to other opioids and withdrawal symptoms for people who are dependent on other opioids. So, and this is one of the substances that's being thrown in with all this other stuff. So talk a little bit about SR 17018 and
Yeah.
like
Yeah, absolutely. So SR 17018 is one of the most mind-bogglingly fascinating substances I've ever read about, and I've read about a lot of different drugs. And to fully appreciate this drug, you got to kind of go back to the beginning of who Dr. Laura Bond is. She got her start at Scripps Research, which is why these compounds are called SR. It stands for Scripps Research. They're just part of uh, a large class of substances that were developed using a hypothesis that Dr. Bond was the first person to present to the world around 2005. In 2005, she worked with some rodent breeding company to create beta-arrestin knockout mice. So you mentioned it earlier. There are essentially, whenever you take a drug and it goes to your brain, and we're probably familiar with the lock and key analogy, where you have a specific lock that's a specific receptor in the brain, and then you have a specific key, which is a drug that looks like the opposite of that lock. So it fits and it activates something. Well, it doesn't just turn it and click it and then boom, subjectivity and the phenomena of consciousness being altered occurs. There are a lot of things which are still being elucidated, but some of which that we understand are these downstream cellular cascade events where for a lot of drugs there's a thing called a G protein which dissociates from the lipid membrane and then travels downward, and it communicates with all of its microscopic friends. And there are other events that cascade from the triggering of a certain receptor subtype, and one of those is beta-arrestin. And Dr. Bond had an idea in mind to see how opioids would present effects differently if the organism taking them did not have that downstream cellular cascading event of beta-arrestin recruitment. So she gave mice, these beta-arrestin knockout mice, standard opioids like morphine, and found that they had reduced respiratory depression, reduced tolerance, reduced the negative side effects that we generally associate with opioids, and why we generally say you gotta be very careful when consuming opioids, because there's a lot of good that can come with them, but there's a lot of real risks that you have to balance and try to work with and reduce any sort of harm that could be associated with that. And so the realization that, oh shit, maybe there is this downstream cellular cascading event known as beta-arrestin that if we remove completely can create opioids that only present the desirable effects of opioids and reduce, limit, or completely mitigate the negative effects of opioids. So having to escalate your dosage over time in order to get the same pain-killing effects, not being constipated, making it a lot safer where one could take a lot larger dose without concerns for toxicity or shutting down of one's breath. And so for 15 years, Dr. Bond explored compounds until August of 2020. She patented SR17018, which in rodent models and higher primate models, I believe using Rhesus monkeys, they found that this is the one that does everything that this hypothesis promised decades ago. it showed that rodents on morphine over time needed a very predictable increasing amount of morphine to stay on the hot plate as long as they were previously. Same for Oxycontin. But then they did SR17018, and they found over the 3-week period that no escalating dosage was required. That these rodents had the same pain-killing effect from the same dose of this opioid day 1 as they did day 21, which is unimaginable. Like, that doesn't happen with opioids. And then they also found that if you get a mouse tolerant to morphine, and then you substitute SR17018, and then keep them on that for a short period of time, and then return to morphine, their morphine tolerance is essentially reset to baseline, where it is quicker reset than simply going cold turkey on morphine. It actually sensitizes the opioid receptor. So these are all really, really, really promising findings in early animal clinical models. But because we live in a state of prohibition, where there are black market and gray market industries that are making billions and billions of dollars a year, stealing IP, producing them in Chinese labs, and then selling them as research chemicals, because they're incentivized to do this because they can't just sell opium or cannabis or mushrooms on the corner store, which is what 90% of people are looking for when they're looking for RCs. They want something that's like Adderall or cocaine or opium or cannabis, and if those things were available to them, they would do that instead of the proliferating alphabet soup of analogs on analogs. Because we live in this state of prohibition, it escaped from the lab, and we started seeing about 11 months ago, maybe like less than a year, people started talking about this on Reddit and saying that they were consuming this compound and that it was having the effects on them and their opioid use patterns as was predicted in these rodent studies. And this is by no means an endorsement of taking SR17018 on your own, because we don't know what long-term effects are. We don't know if there's activity outside of the opioid receptor that might be concerning from a carcinogenic effect or whatever. I personally am of the camp where I think all drugs are good until proven otherwise, just because it's been the opposite for so long, and someone just needs to be the polemicist on the other side to try to move the conversation into a sane middle ground. So I take the standing that drugs are good until proven otherwise. You probably shouldn't do that. You should do some research and figure out.
Leave it to the experts to take that perspective.
And but all to say, the thousands and thousands of people on Reddit have said, hey, I was on 1,000 milligrams of 7-hydroxymetragenine, or I was taking 25 milligrams of Suboxone every single day, or I've been on methadone for 5-6 years, or I've been using heroin or fentanyl, whatever. Long-term users, habitual users of the substance, are talking about painless stepping off of their opioid use pattern in a matter of 1 to 2 to 3 weeks, slowly titrating fairly reasonable doses of SR17018 and getting down to zero. There are people in the chronic pain community who have been on, I've just wonderful stories from some of our volunteers in the organization that has been assembled in rapid time to try to oppose the DEA's prohibition of this compound. The volunteers in this, chronic pain patients, who say that SR17018 has allowed them to stand up out of their wheelchair, and where they only need to use it once a week to get the same pain-killing effect from like a psychological perspective of managing and living with their pain as they were getting from taking 65 milligrams of Dilaudid every day. I mean, truly.
So they're taking it instead of their Dilaudid, or they're taking it alongside like a reduced dose, or
I've seen both, but the volunteer who I'm thinking of specifically, she takes SR17018 like once every 1 or 2 weeks whenever the pain gets so unbearable, and then it sort of like resets her relationship with her pain, is how she's described it.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, it really, really remarkable things here. And these consumers, and people in pain, they should have the right to be able to have the things that make life okay and acceptable and worth living for them. That is a right that they deserve to have in their bodily autonomy. But more broadly than that, and really the angle that I've taken in this whole situation is like this is the one of the most exciting drug discoveries, period. Like opioids for the course of human history have been associated with people dying from taking too much of it or becoming disenchanted with the effects of opioids after using them for a long period of time, because eventually they're taking so much that it sort of over empowers anything else that's going on in their life, and they're sick with constipation all the time, because this is a typical effect of taking a ton of opioids. And the class of opioids, of better, more promising opioids that could stem from SR 17018, or maybe it even is SR 17018, should not be prevented from being looked into due to the listing of SR 17018 in Schedule 1, which is exactly what listing substances in Schedule 1 does. It makes it the burden of a researcher to investigate these compounds goes from, it's already not easy for a researcher to write all these grants and get approval with an IND and all of that stuff to do work on these compounds. But then if you make it a Schedule 1 compound, it just makes it not infinitely, but much, much, much more expensive, and it makes it much harder for them to get approval to do any sort of work with it. If they're going to carry a milligram from their lab room into another lab room, there's like checklists of SOPs that they have to go through. It just makes their life so much harder, and it grinds research to a slow halt. And whenever there's all of this hubbubaloo in the media and the press and public conversation regarding the issues with opioids right now, it seems like what we should be doing is encouraging the acceleration of research into things that show this level of promise, as opposed to, without any evidence for public health harm or addiction abuse potential, whatever, just throw them into Schedule 1 for 3 years with no opportunity for anyone to voice any opposition to it. We think that's wrong. We think that's unconstitutional. We think that's a violation of the Fifth Amendment's right to due process. And so we're taking the DEA to court on a constitutionality challenge.
And so when you say we, remind me, you mentioned earlier, but who is we here?
I feel like I might not have mentioned it yet. So I have been assisting the Rights and Reason Project, which is helmed by an attorney named Robert Rush. Robert Rush.
Oh, I'm familiar with his work. Great attorney.
Yeah, great attorney. He helped litigate for DOI and DOC in 2023. Is definitely like one of the main reasons why those compounds are not scheduled right now. And he's assisted in the background of 7-hydroxy anti-prohibition work, but he has in the 30 days that we were given from the listing of this compound until the deadline expired on the 31st, him and I have brought in dozens and dozens of volunteers who are very passionate about this compound. We've been able to raise money from concerned people all over, from vendors who are selling it in the gray market to people who have just benefited from it, from people with ibogaine clinics in Mexico who have started implementing SR 17018 into their protocol prior to giving ibogaine to people wanting to get off of opioids. There's so many different people have come crawling out of the woodwork to donate and support this. But yes, it's essentially Robert is the figurehead of this whole movement. He structured the basis of our constitutional challenge. We've already filed everything that we could in administrative courts to try to get the DEA to present an opportunity for a level of discussion and conversation, and request more information from them before this is scheduled, which is hopefully at a minimum going to be a 180-day extension. But if they deny that, which seems like they will, because in their emergency scheduling notice, they specifically said that they will not consider any challenges to this and that this will not be adjudicated in administrative court, which is like right there the reason why we're saying this is an infringement upon due process, because you're supposed to have you're supposed to present reasons for taking away rights and liberties before you do it, and they've not.
The Trump administration infringing on due process? You have got to be kidding me right now.
I gotta
That
be
doesn't
kidding me
sound
on
like
that.
them.
Yeah, but it's like, not to be that guy, but this, the DEA's been around since 1970. Like, it's way more than the Trump administration. I would argue that the DEA has been laying the groundwork for the fascist takeover that we're experiencing right now, just through the amount of unchallenged scheduling actions that they've done, and the increased police power that they've done, that they've been responsible for, and the stuffing of the prisons with nonviolent users of different drugs over the past 4 or 5 decades. I mean, it's led to the ruination of millions of lives, the things that the DEA has done. And if you can't connect the dots between the erosion of rights and liberties that have come from the DEA and the place where we are today, being assaulted on all sides for all of our rights and liberties, I'm afraid you might be blinded by partisanship, because this is just a long American tradition of increasing the state's armed police wing in exchange for the reduced rights of citizens. And being able to decide what you put into your own body is a right, and that hopefully that doesn't need to be stated for people. Like, bodily autonomy is a fundamental principle of the Enlightenment period, which is the founding doctrine of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and everything that's supposed to adjudicate how we engage as a society and among each other as adults.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it gets brought up to death in drug circles, but I always think of that John Ehrlichman quote. He was the Nixon advisor who basically said, "Yeah, we knew it was never about the drugs. It was an excuse to criminalize our political enemies," which at the time were anti-war protesters and civil rights activists.
Yep.
So we criminalized their drugs. We went in after them, and I think about that all the time. But circling back to SR 17018. Obviously, you mentioned earlier this is not a drug that has been studied scientifically on humans, though there are a lot of anecdotal testimonies about its use. And obviously, placing it in Schedule 1 would be a very bad thing for the science that desperately needs to get done. One anecdotal thing that I did see interesting, because I was looking into the safety profile of this drug, and the one fatality that I can find associated with this drug is somebody who took it and they had a reduction in their tolerance to other opioids, and then they took a large dose of their previous opioid of choice and they had a fatal overdose. So I thought that was really interesting, that this has such a profound impact on opioid tolerance that it led to a fatal overdose. This is a powerful substance that could be clearly, from my eyes, used for good, but we need the opportunity to study it more.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, there are risks to every single drug. I mean, goes back to Paracelsus. The difference between a medicine and a poison is the dose, and in order to determine what dose is right for what reasons, you have to do some study. You have to do some research on it first. You have to learn about it, and it's best to learn about these effects and the constellation of benefits and harms that can come from these compounds through licit research, as opposed to how weed was researched for so long, where you just had people in their basements running different solvents through different weed, creating different forms of hash, and then smoking with their friends and being like, "Oh, this one's really fucking up my lungs and throat," and other guys are being like, "No, this butane hash stuff, you just let it evaporate off and it's really clean." It's just all to say, maybe not even the best example to pull up there, but you're not going to make the drug go away by prohibiting it. People are going to continue to learn about it, but we can learn a lot more quickly and benefit a lot more people if the research is done in sanctioned environments, in what is there's a lot that could be said about the state of academia today, but like these places that are supposed to breed the people who with the most passion for it and consolidate the most money for specific research that's not supposed to be influenced by any sort of politics or any sort of bias or belief. It's just supposed to determine the reality of how something works, and saying that we can no longer try to determine how things work is like an insane thing to tell someone that you can't do anymore. It's like, oh, hey, we don't think you can figure out how this works anymore because we're afraid that people might get hurt by it. Like this, there's a way to separate and allow the research to continue without making it available on the market right now. And that's all to say that just prohibiting things has created a state where things get thrown to the market rapidly without testing because people are afraid that a slow entrance to the market will minimize the amount of profits. So they want to get it on the market as quickly as possible, sell it to as many people as possible before they predict it's going to get banned, and then they move on to the next thing. So prohibition is pushing things on the market quickly and irresponsibly, and prohibition is also preventing the further understanding of how these things work. There is a better way to do both of those things, and prohibition just ruins it. That's the headline.
Yeah, I really couldn't agree more. So I'm certainly hoping. I certainly got my fingers crossed for this. That you get at least the 180-day extension that you're hoping to get. Although it sounds like this DEA and this particular administration, not that past administrations wouldn't have done the exact same thing, but it sounds like this particular administration takes a certain pride in flouting precedent and norms and rules and all that stuff. I want to be cognizant of your time, things you want to get to. I know you're trying to scream this message from the rooftops everywhere, but do we have a little time to talk about tianeptine and some of the stuff you're doing there?
Would love to, because tianeptine is one of the last drugs that are slated to be scheduled by the DEA that still has an open public comment window, and is so I think it's the 7th where the comment window and the 30-day notice expires. So tianeptine goes way back. The story for tianeptine is just profoundly interesting. It is probably the original gas station heroin that a lot of media was throwing under the bus. It was in things like Zaza Red, which I believe is still sold in gas station head shops. It was in a product called Neptune's Fix, which someone plagiarized and created a knockoff Neptune's Fix that contained more than tianeptine in it, that resulted in some people's deaths, that resulted in the actual Neptune Fix producer going out of business because of the FDA getting all up in their business. But so this is an opioid that has been on the market in the United States for a very long time. But it got its start in the late 70s outside of the United States by a French pharmaceutical firm. They released it as an antidepressant. And if you look at it, it looks like this older class of antidepressants that we used before we moved over to like SSRIs, like Prozac, and these things that are sort of the first treatment modalities for depression these days. Previously, we had these things called tricyclic antidepressants, which were not as efficacious as the antidepressants we have today, which are also not that efficacious, but whatever. And they also had a little bit more toxicity associated with them. But they have sort of like a butterfly shape and then a long tail. And that's what tianeptine looks like structurally. And it initially launched on the market as an SSRE, a selective serotonin reuptake enhancer, which sort of flies in the face of every theory of mood that was used to develop antidepressant drugs, which was things like serotonin, dopamine, catecholamine, these monoamines, we needed more of them in the brain to feel good, and whenever we had less of them in the brain, we didn't feel that great. And this is sort of like a terrible reduction of the human condition, which is why a lot of these drugs are not effective for a lot of people. Works for some people, so it seems like they're scratching something real there, but there's a lot more to be learned, and there's a lot more neurotransmitters than the main six that we endlessly talk about. So this was a really interesting drug when it was proposed, because they said, oh, this treats depression by reducing the amount of serotonin in the brain, by increasing its being scrubbed from the synapses, so there's less serotonin available. But hey, whatever, it's working for people, so we're going to sell it at 12.5 milligram doses as an antidepressant throughout Europe and parts of South America. And it was very effective, and it was an opioid that many people, it was an antidepressant that many people found effective for a number of years. And then in 2014, some Columbia University researchers were looking into tianeptine and were trying to explore, what was going on there, because on the internet people were talking about using tianeptine for depression, but they were saying like, this stuff just feels like heroin, man, and I'm taking like 10 grams of it a day now, which is an insane dose compared to the prescribed 12.5 milligrams. So people were describing it as having heroin-like effects, and people were also describing taking doses that if it were like heroin, like it would have been 20, 30, 40, 50 times over the tolerable dose, maximum dose, before you would kill yourself with it. Just insane doses. So remarkably safe, but creating effects that were not aligned with tricyclic antidepressants. So they studied this in rodents in Columbia University, and they ended up saying, hey, there's like a little bit going on with serotonin here, and like how it like moves throughout the brain of the mice is different compared to control. But we think that's all mediated by its very strong affinity for the mu opioid receptor. And in 2014, after like 30 years of being on the market, its classification moved from a serotonergic antidepressant to just a full-fledged opioid. And after that sort of realization hit, and there were people who were buying buckets of this on the internet prior to that and consuming it, it started to proliferate throughout the gray market because of prohibition, as we already discussed. And a lot of people started taking it, and then, like any opioid, people started realizing that if they used it regularly and at large doses, that they escalated over time, it was hard to stop using it. And so the media, moralized about how addiction is really, really bad, for reasons that I don't fully understand. Addiction can benefit people's lives because it might be better than what they're dealing with alternatively. Maybe addiction is bad for people's lives, but addiction in itself is not necessarily good or bad. So tianeptine, very safe opioid that a lot of people have been using for a long time. It was listed on July 7th in the Federal Register with a formal rulemaking process that included 8 factors for why the DEA believed that it should be included in Schedule 1 alongside mushrooms and MDMA and cannabis, the really deadly, scary drugs. And so, originally I was having to triage all of these drugs that were coming out there. I was like, okay, I can focus on the kratom alkaloids and kratom alkaloid analogs by, trying to orient the documentary to some sort of quick advocacy piece that will get people to comment on this. I'll help with that. Who's going to save SR 17018? Okay, no one's taking this on. Let's try to get Robert together and see if we can get some money to fund a legal challenge. And we were able to do that. But at the same time, it's breaking my heart, that O-desmethyltramadol, like remarkably safe opioid. I mean, it's definitely killed a few people, but that's because it's being sold in the black market as something else, and so people don't know how to dose it. And this was actually like the original kratom deaths, the krypton deaths of 2009 in Sweden, were because it was kratom powder adulterated with O-desmethyltramadol. But O-desmethyltramadol is not necessarily good or bad or toxic or safe. It is a drug that you can learn how to use it, and compared to other opioids, it's remarkably safe. Unfortunately, no one's making any money off of O-desmethyltramadol these days, and there is no appetite for a legal fight, and lawyers cost a lot of money, and I don't have that kind of money to pay to defend it. So had to let that one go. Same thing for SR 14968 and spirochlorophene and chlororphene. Those compounds are not being sold. There's not money to defend it, and I don't have the money personally to defend those. So that sucked. But there was that for SR17, and now, fortunately, through volunteers connecting me with some of their vendors, we've been able to bring a bunch of vendors into the space who are willing to support a legal challenge against the DEA's intention to schedule tianeptine. And we think that there's a remarkable, there's a really promising chance with tianeptine specifically because there is a pathway to administrative court that is not specifically outlined in emergency scheduling rulings. So that's why it's important to know sort of like the different ways the DEA works and goes about scheduling things. Because tianeptine has a really easy pathway to challenge that's a lot cheaper than the SR fight or the 7-hydroxy fights. And so that's just happened very recently, and there's a lot of really good people in the space who all have come together and are offering to wage this war against the DEA with us. And we hope to be successful, at the very least delay it, and we are again focusing not on how people are using it and how it may benefit them, but in fact on the research harms associated with putting this compound in Schedule 1. This is more or less because that is what we believe to be the strongest legal theory and strategy for challenging the DEA, is predicating everything upon research harms as opposed to conscious liberty and bodily autonomy, things that are sort of underlying my advocacy, but the DEA doesn't give a shit about. So we have to be strategic here. So that's the long version of that short story, or short version of the long story. I don't know. A little twisted here, and God, I could use a good night's rest, because ever since July 1st and the first scheduling of these things, it has just been, it's been insane. Like it's really, everyone is scared. Everyone's afraid that they're going to be forced to go through withdrawal cold turkey. Everyone's afraid that they're going to call their old dealer who's selling who the fuck knows what these days and potentially risk overdosing, because these are not drugs that you just suddenly drop after using regularly for a long time. And who are we to tell people to stop using a thing that they find benefits their lives? And if they're struggling with it, then we're not going to help them by making it a criminal matter. Like, if someone's addicted to 7-OH or tianeptine or O-desmethyltramadol, you're not going to help them by directing the DEA to point guns at them and throw them into a prison. This is just not how you compassionately engage with people in having problems.
No, obviously not. And I want to reiterate this for people who might broadly agree with the thrust of our arguments, but have some sort of opiophobia or discomfort with these specific drugs or the widespread availability of them. And it's to echo something you said at the beginning of this conversation, which is that this is an era where there is a comparative abundance of comparatively safe opioids. Like when you look at overdoses, I live in Portland, Oregon. Everybody who listens to this knows I live in Portland, Oregon. You walk through downtown Portland, Oregon, you do see a lot of people in some sort of state of nodding off or overdose, or certainly drug addiction. And while I haven't talked to all of them, certainly I don't make a habit out of this, I've talked to some, it's always fentanyl, really. And to some extent methamphetamine as well, but that's not what's causing them to nod off or whatever. Those are the drugs that are contributing to what we consider the drug crisis or the overdose crisis, at least where I live. It's not 7-OH, it's not tianeptine. These are things that have been sold in gas stations for a while. Some people do get into serious trouble with them, but that isn't the crisis. And certainly you have these things like SR 17018, like, I didn't know if this was a real crisis, I would know what this is, right? I would have heard of this before this year, and it's not a crisis. And I have to wonder, especially with SR 17018, like, is it just the government trying to exert control, or is there some sort of funding mechanism that's connected to, like, I don't know, Suboxone, or this is the conspiracy brain inside me that's wondering, like, is there somebody who's making money off of people not having these alternatives? But I don't know if that's a question we even know the answer to.
I mean, a lot of people are suspicious. A lot of people are letting the conspiratorial thoughts in their brains, run wild, and for good reason, because it sounds like the whole feel free 70H, conundrum feels very conspiratorial, but there are receipts for that. And so everyone's trying to think like, oh, is this conspiracy also related to these other compounds? And the DEA is certainly not helping their case whenever, a day or two after the last scheduling notice comes out, they post in the Federal Register a whole abundance of new rules, loosening the restrictions on distribution of buprenorphine, Suboxone, and methadone, and making it easier for doctors to prescribe this, and creating new rules that make telehealth for these things more readily available, and essentially just granting billions of dollars in business to the opioid maintenance drug therapy industrial complex, be it from the people who create the clinics that people have to go through, and the SOPs that they have to be followed, and the locks on the doors, and how that's prescribed, and the hours they do it, and
The humiliation ritual, let's be honest.
yeah.
When it comes to methadone, at the very least, anyone who's ever talked to someone who needs methadone, it's a humiliation ritual. You have to go every day to get your dose, and it's a way of just having people's lives controlled.
Definitely. And I also want to be on the record as saying I have no problem with methadone and buprenorphine, and as like drugs, they can be good and they can be bad, and all depends on how they're used, and they've certainly helped a lot of people, but I don't think they should be forced upon every single person who wants to use an opioid. That's fucked up. So anyway, the DEA is not helping their case in the conspiracies by granting the opioid maintenance therapy industry billions of dollars and lightening of restrictions just a few days after this. But I do think that Occam's razor for this whole thing is just looking at the history of the DEA and going, the DEA is a hammer and the drugs are a nail, and they're just going to pound them as they see them. And they don't think about it. They don't get challenged on this. There's nothing weird or strange or conspiratorial for the people at the DEA who are making this decision. This is just part of their job, and as they see it, this is a drug that's bad that they need to get rid of in order to protect the streets. And people certainly hold that belief system, and I just cannot think of any other reason why all of these things are being listed at the same time. I don't think that there is a feel free-esque conspiracy that can be attributed to every single one of these compounds that are trying to be scheduled right now.
Well, either way, it's not good news, but I'm glad there's people like you out there fighting the good fight and mobilizing lawyers and advocates to, protect cognitive liberty and public health by whatever means possible. So, to my fans, I strongly encourage you to watch the 70H chemistry video that Hamilton Morris just put out. What's the name of the organization you're partnering with?
Rights and Reason Project. rightsandreasonproject.com with Robert Rush.
Yeah, check that out. Robert Rush, rightsandreasonproject.com.
We expect these court cases to take a long time, which means that we're going to have to be moving our plaintiffs to and from the court, getting them hotels and flights. Our attorneys are going to have to be flying to and from these cases. We're going to have paralegals and law clerks that are going to be working on the rebuttals to when the DEA dismisses all of our motions. We're going to have to appeal all of those. And over the course of a 1 to 2 year challenge for something like SR specifically, we could see this costing $500,000 to $700,000 based on back of the envelope ChatGPT calculations for this. We've been able to raise a decent amount of cash right now, but nowhere near what the predicted expenses are going to run by the time we get this, hopefully, to the Supreme Court. So if anyone is willing to pitch in a little bit of money to help us carry this through all the way to the end and hopefully permanently restrict the DEA's powers so that they have to go through formal rulemaking process for every drug that they want to schedule and have legitimate evidence for every piece of data that they're putting out there as cause for the removal of this drug from legitimate commerce. We're saying they have to do that. And this constitutional challenge is not going to just benefit SR 17018, but it's going to benefit anyone and every drug that could potentially be emergency scheduled in the future. So if you care about MDMA, if you care about psilocybin, if you care about 5-APP, 6-APP, Moxie, Foxy, any of these cool drugs that exist out there that are presently legal, not like MDMA, but if it comes legal again and the DEA wants to schedule it, so they can't do it arbitrarily and capriciously through emergency scheduling. They actually have to present evidence for it. If we win this case, we could substantially reduce the domain of authority which the DEA is able to flex. And that's our ultimate goal here. It's more than just these compounds, but these compounds are very special and they are very charismatic and they are going to guide us and lead us in this fight to beat back against the DEA's continual infringement upon our rights and liberties.
Soren, I think you are very charismatic. Soren Shade, thank you so much for stopping by Drug Cultures.
Thank you, Sky. I always love listening to your stuff.
Well, thank you for listening, and I hope you have enjoyed today's episode of Drug Cultures featuring Soren Shade. Please make sure to check out the Rights and Reason Project and also the latest Hamilton Morris video on YouTube about the chemistry of 7-OH that Soren just produced. There's going to be the full documentary coming soon. If you like the show and want to give us a follow, you can follow us on Twitter at DrugCulturesPod, Instagram at consciousness_cultures, shoot an email at drugculturespodcast@gmail.com. And as always, please be sure to give the show 5 stars wherever you listen to it, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whatever. Apparently it helps in the algorithm. I choose to believe it because I like the attention. Until next time.